It's time to get your music radio ready with the AudioSkills podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Scott here with this week's episode of the AudioSkills podcast. We have got a great show for you today where we're going to be talking all about in-the-box mastering with Adam Harr, who is a successful mixing and mastering engineer who is also an AudioSkills instructor. But before diving into that, though, I wanted to give you your audio tip of the week. My tip this week is more of a philosophical one, and that tip is don't forget the importance of dynamics. So what do I mean by that? Well, a track should be dynamic. Music is meant to be dynamic. That keeps it interesting, that keeps it engaging, that keeps it sounding good and being exciting and surprising or unexpected to the listener. And so many people, when they start using compression or they really start wanting to build volume in and things like that, they can forget about dynamics. So, make your chorus stand out a little more, or maybe be a little louder or more energetic than your verse. Maybe, for whatever reason, just mix it up a bit and have some quiet parts, some loud parts. Play it like real musicians would play. Remember that if you're mixing, even if you're programming something, even if you're just producing, keep in mind that performances are meant to be dynamic, and you will be better served if you do that while you are mixing, mastering, producing, whatever it is that you are doing. Dynamics is so crucial. So that's my audio tip of the week. So now I am so stoked to introduce our guest for this week. His name is Adam Harr, and he's a mixing and mastering engineer based out of California. And he has worked with artists like Cheap Trick, Frank Ocean, Muse, and Bruno Mars, while also working with legendary producers like Pharrell and Rick Rubin. And he's also an AudioSkills instructor, having put together the Mastering Crash Course, which is a step-by-step walkthrough of mastering in the box, available right now on audioskills.com. Adam, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Right on. Now, you recently took a pretty big road trip, right?
Yeah, I did.
Where'd you go?
We went and caught the eclipse up in northwestern Wyoming, and then my girlfriend and I traveled all around the West pretty much. Caught, 8 states, 13 national parks. It was about 5,500 miles altogether, I think.
Wow, that's amazing. I did a big road trip out west a number of years ago, hit some national parks and things with my now wife, and it was just amazing. What was your favorite national park?
Oh, man. I've always wanted to go to the Tetons and got to spend a few days there. My girlfriend always wanted to go to the Grand Canyon, and we stopped there. But the first one we both want to go back to is Bryce Canyon in southeastern, I think, Utah, which was a very unique place. A lot of interesting erosion and some cool canyons and valleys to explore.
Dude, that's awesome. Yeah, you just realize how beautiful and vast the United States is when you go on a road trip.
Yeah,
that's one of those big things.
So many different people, so many different kind of cultures, and we're all kind of crammed into this one spot all together, and it's great. I love it.
Absolutely. So to start us off, could you just tell us a little bit more about your audio journey and what you've got going on at Adam Harr Mixing and Mastering?
Yeah. Well, I started off going to audio school, conservatory, recording arts and sciences in Tempe down in Arizona. And at the time I wanted to go into post-production audio. So I was real into being a sound designer, working on kind of placing sound effects and gunfights and action scenes for movies. And so I pretty much started out going that direction, and then through a roommate who was a manager at a big recording studio here in Burbank, I got a runner job at Glenwood Place Recording Studios. It still is a big pop music studio. I got a lot of hands-on experience with big, large format consoles, microphones, all the great toys, and then kind of worked my way up through there and then moved over to East West Studios and was real lucky to be a staff engineer there for about 3-4 years. And that's where I was able to connect with Cheap Trick, Billy Idol, a lot of great people there. So, yeah, I've been really lucky over the years to end up at some really nice high-end studios. Definitely a lot of work to stay on staff and a lot of hours involved in the commitment of climbing the ranks. But it's always been really good and I got a lot of great experience. And that kind of led me to realizing there's a lot of engineers out there and there's a lot of people who love doing what we do. And so a lot of people are real focused on the recording side of it. And I've started so many projects with great artists and things that never get finished or they don't necessarily get finished as well as they should, or they spend all their money on the microphones and the recording process and then realize they have a bunch of great multi-tracks that still don't sound like a hit record.
Right.
So I've decided to kind of consolidate that. I love mixing. It's one of the best parts of our job. And mastering is something I got into at East West, where it just started with catching up with friends who were making music and then, hey, let me run your tracks through the console, let me run, and then adding here and there. And I just developed my own little approach using all the real equipment that I was lucky to be around at East West. And then once I left East West, I've bounced around a whole bunch of different places freelancing and always kind of carried the mastering in my back pocket. And so in the last few years, I've really focused on that. I found I really like it. I don't have to spend hours and hours in the studio waiting for somebody to show up.
Yeah.
Which is a big part of it.
Oh, sure.
And so, and also it lets people come to me and I get to use my ears and not necessarily just be the monkey press and record. So I really kind of focused on a place where you can come finish your records. A lot of people have great places to start them and a lot of places to write and record, but we get to that point and then nobody knows what to do with all those multi-tracks. So yeah, so my place, you can come get it mixed, come get it mastered, any combo of the two. I've done overdubs, some background vocals, percussion, and just add into the mix as we're getting to those final stages. So it's a little bit of everything, but I definitely focus on finishing records right, I guess.
I love that, and that's actually something I've talked about just in general, with home studio guys or bedroom producers, whatever. It's so easy to get an idea and start recording some things or whatever.
And everybody's so excited about it. It's really easy to lose that. So.
Yeah, and then you kind of get into that stretch, that home stretch or whatever, and it's like, sometimes it can be tough or whatever. And the point is, well, if you don't finish it, then what have you really done?
Yeah, and it's easy to like I said, you get really excited about the writing and then you get the song how you want it. And then a lot of artists will move on and then they kind of forget about the finishing of it and making the song come to life. And then with mastering, it's kind of it's almost like Latin to some engineers where they don't quite understand what's going on. They overcomplicate it a little bit. So yeah, I've kind of streamlined the process and it's really great to let me come in and I'm excited now because I'm hearing everything fresh and now I can provide my musical background. I grew up playing trumpet and play bass these days. So I'm a musician first and this is my instrument. So if you are able to let that come and you bring your work to me and let me kind of apply my skill set to it, I'll be really excited about it and finish that excitement and then get you back excited about your song or your album or whatever. So I enjoy it. I like finishing things for people, and it's really a good feeling to send it off and have it be like that's the way it's going to be for the rest of the time.
For sure. And kind of speaking to that, on this episode, I want to talk about in-the-box mastering, which is really the finishing touches for sure. And that's, for those who don't know, in-the-box mastering is mastering, pretty much entirely in a computer without using, external gear and things like that. Now, to start us off with that, Adam, there is still debate on in the box versus outside of the box mastering. There's people who will claim that one is better than the other, that one sounds great, the other sounds like crap, whatever it is. Where do you personally fall on that? And can you get great results mastering entirely in the box?
Yeah, that's something I've gone around with a few people on, and definitely had to convince some clients that, keeping it digital might be a better option depending on their production style. For me personally, I come from an analog studio. Both East West and Glenwood have been good homes to me, and so those are the nicest of, old school large format studios. So I was really lucky to get a good foundation in analog engineering. But that also led me to believe that there's a lot of issues that arise with analog, from noise or conversion, things like that. So I decided to kind of go a little bit more towards digital, keeping it. I'm a big Pro Tools fan. I love Pro Tools. So I kind of keep everything in my ballpark there. But there is a big debate between analog versus digital. And so one of my big things is most of the music production these days, especially in pop music, hip hop, rap, whatever, it's going to be almost 90% produced in the digital realm through Ableton,
Right.
Logic. And there's a lot of conversion that goes on when you have to start moving from an analog to digital back to an analog world. And even when I'm tracking vocals for people and we're putting lyrics and top lines over their beats, I'm recording that mostly in Pro Tools or some kind of computer program. I don't know anybody who's tracking vocals in a modern sense on a tape machine too much anymore, unless they're a rehearsed band and going more. And honestly, working at some of these analog studios, we set up all the 2-inch machines and we get it all ready, and then we just dump it to Pro Tools after they get that effect on it. So chances are it's going to be digital for most of its life. And then right at the very end, people want to convert it and dump it into an analog world. People want to kind of add a whole lot of ones and zeros to the process over the final thing. And so I was real lucky to work for Gavin Larson at Larson Mastering right after I left East West for the better part of a year or so. And he's a great engineer, great mastering facility, but he works primarily analog, and a lot of my job was to go through and add some no noise type filtering to get rid of the sound of the converters, especially when things started getting loud. And I found that was, as an engineer coming from a very high end recording background, that's the last thing you want to be adding to a master is digital software that's removing things and artifacts. So I really try not to add too many artifacts, and if I can keep it all digital, there's a reason for it. But at the same time, I've done a lot of A/B comparisons between, I guess most recently would be an API compressor. We had one at the studio that was real versus the UAD version of it. And the UAD version sounds great, but the real one just kind of had that extra magic around the edges of the sound. So there is a quality to the real thing that I will not discount at all. If you have chances to use the real thing in your recording process, by all means, go for it. But some of this digital development that's been going on is getting real close. And frankly, if you use it right, it doesn't really matter if it's analog or digital. It's what you get out of it. So with that's a big part of it. Plus, analog is going to be probably 10 times more expensive. I think a real shadow bills is upwards of $50,000, whereas the UAD version is maybe $350,000. So that definitely is a factor in a small.
There's some economics there.
Yeah. But at the same time, the master I recently did for a client of mine he wasn't happy with the way his mix turned out, and they sent it to somebody big who had full analog setup, and he gave it to me, and we were just playing around, and we started comparing his mix that had a limiter on it, my master, and the analog master. And the analog master was the last choice for all of us. It was, it didn't have the dynamics. It didn't have the loudness and presence that, he would want from his mix. And so to me, that was a little small victory of just it doesn't matter what your gear is. It's how you set your settings and you turn your knobs and the results you get out of that.
Absolutely.
So, but, it's each to their own. And really what it is getting the results. That's my main thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a great way to sum it all up. It's people can argue till they're blue in the face about which is better or whatever, but, it's about the result. And there's no, nothing wrong with going analog, and there's nothing wrong with going digital.
And a lot of people also forget that in today's world, especially on the major label game, it's a high turnover. We're in the world of fast food music, real fast, easy to produce, might not have a whole lot of nutritional content to it, but it needs to get out fast. And a lot of artists these days put off turning their records in until the very last minute. And so mixing and mastering is like an overnight process. And in the digital world, you can move at that pace, whereas in an analog world, that's just not possible. You can't keep up. Mm-hmm. It's a big one. That's a big part of it.
For sure. So getting into maybe some actionables or some advice here, if you could give one best mastering tip to help someone get better results, what would that tip be?
I would say keep your perspective. That's really easy to lose when you're mastering. Same with mixing. You can really start to just narrow in on one little aspect and forget about, what the rest of the elements are doing. I get stuck on kick drums a lot, and that's usually where I start. So I love diving into kick drums and drum sounds, and you start forgetting that, most people don't know the difference between a Gretsch kit and a Ludwig kit and, this mic versus that mic. They just want to know that the drums rock and the vocal sits nicely. And so with mastering, you're dealing with even smaller details, and you can really get narrowed in on one element and you lose perspective. And so I have it set up. I like to be able to switch between the original mix that I was given and then what I'm working on as a master, as well as being able to click over and hear something finished. As like I use Get Lucky as a good example, just to give me some perspective when I'm working. I'll sit and listen to that maybe 30 seconds to Get Lucky and then click back over to what I'm listening to, just to make sure that I'm in the ballpark of what sounds good and what, so I'm not losing my perspective, because I've definitely turned in masters, especially when I was younger, and they're going like, great, but, it doesn't have any life to it, or it doesn't have anything kind of ready to go. And I'm just, I totally lost my perspective. Let me take that back and I'll get you a new one real quick. And
for sure.
So it's easy to do with mastering, because you're ending up worrying about these tiny little details most people don't quite know are even there. So yeah, maintaining your perspective is probably one of the best things you can do for yourself.
For sure. That's so huge. And then having like a reference, like you mentioned with Get Lucky, I know in the mastering crash course, you actually do discuss that and show that. I think it doesn't matter how much experience you have or how good you are or you think you are. It's always possible to just kind of lose a little of that perspective. So I think that's a really great tip.
It's really funny. You can actually kind of overdo it sometimes. I turned in a classical piano record a few years ago, and I realized that it was louder than everything else, and that wasn't necessarily ideal either. It was like, I don't want somebody to have to reach for their volume knob in a huge way when my master comes on versus somebody else's. So yeah, it's easy to kind of get lost in your own little world there.
Sure. And so kind of connected to all this, you were talking about, maintaining your perspective and things like that. In this mastering crash course, you go through how you master a song in the box, pretty much step by step. When you are mastering a song, what would you say your overall philosophical approach is? What are your goals sonically when you're kind of working on a master?
Well, I guess first off, you want to make it better. You don't ever want somebody to give it to you and it comes out worse.
Yeah, that would probably be bad. You wouldn't be in business long.
You want to do something for them. And obviously, if you're getting a great mix, sometimes there's not a whole lot to do in mastering except kind of level it out and make sure it doesn't blow the roof off anything at a certain point. But there are also times when you might not have a mix that sits as well as you would like it to, and you might have to work a little bit harder to get it to feel good across all the different mediums that it's going to end up being played on. And so that's a big part of it, is trying to figure out where the crossroads of, doing too much or too little is. And sometimes part of the reason I got into mastering is a good story. Is part of the reason I got into mastering is a good friend of mine at East West was working on his mix, and he sent it out to one of the big mastering guys here in Hollywood. And he's like, I walked in late night one night, and he was just sitting there, and I could see him really trying to convince himself to like his master that he got back. And I really was like, I don't like it. And he was like, yeah, I paid a lot of money for it, though. I don't kind of want to like it. And I was like, well, let me just take a stab at it. I was starting out, we didn't do a whole lot of money exchange, and we just kind of both worked on it together. And he ended up liking mine more because I didn't change his mix. And that's a major part of it for me, is I'm not here to remix the mix. That's not the goal of mastering. It's to kind of clean it up and trim some of the fat and then let it translate. You want those emotions to come through an iPhone speaker versus, the best hi-fi system you can have. That emotion of the song needs to be the same. And so with that, that's why I use Get Lucky. That's one of those songs that just sounds good on everything. And Daft Punk is an amazing, they know what they're doing, and they had Pharrell involved, and then everybody who worked on it technically is top notch. But at that, they are really able to get that song to translate across everything. And for me, it's kind of the holy grail of that aspect of mastering. So, yeah, my goal is not to reinvent the wheel, but to shine it up a little bit. So,
for sure. And make it better than when you got it.
Yeah, that's the key. You don't want to suck out some dynamics. That's really easy to do. You can suck out some of the dynamics in the feel. And I'm always kind of constantly reminded of that when I get notes and things like that. So it's always a fun part of that.
Right on. For sure. Now, helping a master be competitive with other commercial recordings and productions is, one of the big goals in mastering. And especially for folks out there who are listening right now and, maybe they're recording and mixing from home and things like that, and they want to be competitive. And even with streaming services normalizing things, loudness still has a place in that. Can you describe how you build loudness into a master and maybe offer, a few tips or advice for folks who are wanting to do that and they don't want to, go overboard or ruin things?
Yeah. One of my big things is when I tell people, especially newer people to the process of mastering, what I'm going to be doing for them, a lot of it is I tell them I'm going to be adding presence while trimming the fat. And so if you're able to kind of trim some of the sonic fat of the mix, that will allow you to push things a little bit louder without overloading and causing distortion or making things kind of fold in on themselves. So if you're able to identify those areas where maybe some of the low mids build up a little bit and you can kind of shave them out by half a dB or dB or something like that, you're now not necessarily changing the mix, but you are opening it up. One of my big, I think, light bulb moments for me at East West was one of my first clients and a friend of mine. She had done her whole mix herself. It sounded great. It's a great record. But at one point we were just like, these vocals are just overwhelming. And I think I pulled out maybe 2.2 kilohertz by maybe like 0.3 to 5 dB. And I just felt the whole mix open up. It got louder.
Wow.
I was able to work compression into it a little bit better without having, being able to hear the compressor as much. And so with that, I was able to really pull the fat out of it. And that was a big moment. That was one of those aha moments for me. And she loves me for it. It was one of the easiest things as an engineer I've done, and, had a client for life out of it. And so it was the ability to kind of identify and then trim the appropriate amount of fat out of it that allowed me to then build in my gain staging into another level of loudness without opening things up. And so the other half of that is getting your compressors to work together. Gain staging I talk about in the crash course a lot probably. And so it's definitely a major part of it, as it is with recording a good sound. And when you're mixing, you definitely want to be making sure your gain staging is right so you're not blowing your stereo bus, through the roof. And So I spent a lot of time moving fractions of a dB in my gain staging just to make sure I can get my meters moving and working without turning red, while the presence is a good way to kind of think about it. I add a present, I kind of raise the entire recording up in the medium and make it a little bit more present or loud. That's pretty much what loudness is too. And so that's important because, early on in the early 2000s and late 90s, during the loudness, like the height of the loudness wars, that was a big deal because we had the ability to kind of add digital limiting and things like that to analog recordings. But you are sacrificing dynamics, so there's kind of a line of chaos there that you have to watch in your meters going too loud or you sucking all the dynamics out of it, and then also making it a little too loud or a little too soft. And so, like I said earlier, I don't want somebody listening, especially when my song is in the playlist on shuffle. I don't want them all of a sudden to be like, wait, I can't hear that, or wow, that's way too loud. I don't want them to have to reach too far for their volume knob at that point. So making it work together with other recordings, that's again why I check things to make sure I'm in the ballpark of other successful releases and things like that. So, but adding loudness is definitely something that people want out of mastering and want out of their products that are competing on the radio with other products. So to me, compression and how you use it is probably one of the most important parts for adding that presence and that loudness, while also using EQ to kind of trim some of that fat.
Right on. That all makes a ton of sense. So in one of the videos, you walk through, in the Mastering Crash Course, you walk through how you would use a tape saturation plugin to help improve the sound of the master. Can you tell us why you would do something like that when mastering in the box, and why that would be so crucial? What does a tape saturation really give you?
For me, like I said earlier, I come from an analog school of thought. I work primarily digitally these days for mixing and mastering, but my thought process, my engineering background comes all from analog world. So with that, back in the day, we were getting mixes delivered on 1/2-inch or 1/4-inch tape, and that added a quality. People would choose their tape machine, they'd choose their tape stock, they would choose what type of tape head they were going to be using for the printing process, and then use that as part of their sound. And so in today's world, we have digital just by nature is a little bit more sterile. There might not be as much vibe in the actual medium that it's being recorded in. So I've learned to kind of love a little bit of tape saturation. Again, you don't want to change too much. You don't want to have too much, you don't want to add too much character to the sound.
Yeah, you don't want to color it too much. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, some of these plugins are really helpful in that you can just click through options and find the tape stock that works best with that specific mix or that specific music or style or whatever. And then also in the digital world, I use it as a gain staging area. I'll sometimes put it at the very beginning of the chain, or I'll put it, I think in the crash course, I put a tape emulation between the EQs and the compressors. And that allows me now to have a solid gain staging area. If I need to kind of push the compressors a little bit more, I can just turn the tape machine up a little bit here or there. And some of the UAD tape machines have way too many options, and you can really start manipulating just the tiny little feelings of the music, and that'll sometimes put you off on the right foot right before you even start, and it's doing some EQ curve just out of character that might lend itself to helping what you're already trying to do with an EQ. So to me, it's just a tool at that point to add a little bit of character to your master in a spot where you might not otherwise have it. And it comes from, if I was working in an analog world and somebody delivered me their album on a 1/4-inch tape, I'd have to work those characteristics of the tape stock and the tape machine and everything into my master already. So on the digital world, I'm really excited to be able to control the tape machine a little bit more than I once was.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Big part for me. So And then also, for me, a lot of it is trial and error. That's one thing I like about digital is being able to, okay, that's not working. Grab another compressor, plug in and throw it in. And instead of having to go rent something or, buy a whole new piece of gear.
Yeah, hang on. I got to lug this out because this isn't working.
Yeah, pretty much. So that was one of my big lessons early on was the day the Fairchild wasn't the answer. And it sounded a lot better without the Fairchild in it. And it broke my heart to pull that beautiful compressor out of my mastering chain, but the whole product came out way better for it. And that was a big lesson for me. So having the ability in a tape machine to choose different tape heads and, widths was also changing the stock and the speed and not having to, call a tech to come realign my machine is a huge part of it for me.
For sure. So you were kind of mentioning a little of this earlier when you were talking about that moment when you sort of really, earlier in your career where you used some EQ and you like took out a little bit and it just really opened everything up. But speaking of EQ, what tips or advice might you have for using EQ effectively in mastering and getting great results and not doing too much?
Yeah. Well, I guess if you haven't put it together yet, that for me in mastering, it's all about the subtle moves, the very small adjustments to do big results with. So with EQ, if I'm moving more than a dB or 2 at the most, I feel like I'm doing something wrong, or I'm pulling the wrong frequency or working on the wrong frequency. And so for me, a lot of it is subtractive EQing that goes back to trimming that sonic fat a little bit and finding an area that I can not necessarily take away from the mix, but I can find somewhere where it's a little overloaded and a little thick and trim it out so that gives me a little bit of space elsewhere to work. So for that, I recommend a few different kinds of EQ, maybe layered in on top of each other. It's not uncommon to use one piece of gear for me just to do one tiny little thing. And then, so I'm only really using maybe 1% of what that box can do or what that plugin can do. But at the same time, I'm using it in that 1% that it absolutely needs to be addressed in. And so, and then also with that, a lot of people, when I was doing more recording and tracking, I never really messed with EQ cues as much. I was more just find that frequency, boost it or cut it and get what I needed out of it and adjust the cue a little bit. But for me in mastering, the cue of an EQ has become one of my best friends. It's something you can really know you're in the right, you're centered around the right frequency, but you're doing a little too much or you're doing not enough, and you can widen or narrow the cue of that EQ band and find that it adjusts everything around that problem spot in a way that you didn't quite realize. And so for me, I use the cue of my EQ all the time when I'm mastering. Like I said, as opposed to recording, I just kind of do some broad moves. But I've had a few problems where the cue really came in handy for me and I was able to just widen something or narrow something a little bit and have the whole master open up without me having to move too much of how much or what frequency I was messing with. So that's my main one. Remember your cues.
That's awesome. No, I love that. I mean, it's one of those things where, everybody thinks that mixing and mastering, it's all so complex, but like something as basic as, well, just think about, what's your cue? How many frequencies are you targeting? What, how's that going? Just focusing in on something like that can really help you, open things up and get better results.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that, I mean, when I was in school, I remember my EQ class, and they focused a lot on boosting and attenuating and knowing your, ear training your different frequencies and knowing all these things. Like personally, I'm terrible at naming frequencies. I'm better. I think of it in a little bit more abstract terms and aim for the high mids, low mids, the areas where the vocals kind of get thick, the areas where, the bass and some of the guitars or mid-range instruments might get a little thick on themselves. And so to me, it's more listening and then feeling what your EQ is doing as opposed to worrying about what number you're exactly doing and, exactly how many dB of this and that you're doing. So, yeah, I would say that, subtractive EQ and Q width is really, really important to me in my work, at least. That's not to say that I don't. Sometimes I use kind of semi-parametric EQs, like I love Pultex and Curve Bender and things like that to really add a real broad character to it. And sometimes I'll use something like that to kind of add a little bit of roundness or warmth to the low end, or add a little bit of sparkle to the high end or something like that. But as I probably did in the Mastering Crash course, I really follow that with a surgical EQ that I can really get in there and pull those parts out that I know are getting too much or, are starting to kind of make everything a little too thick. So.
Absolutely. So, okay, that's EQ. Compression, beyond obviously being subtle and that kind of thing. Do you have any tips or advice for using compression effectively when you're mastering in the box?
Yeah, as it's really the same idea as the EQ, is you can really overdo it. And compression, especially in our kind of modern world, everybody loves compression. And, especially in rock, I know so many people who just smash things and get that real big fat sound. And there's, it's great. It serves its purpose. But honestly, compression is one of my least favorite tools that we have as audio engineers because it is so overused and it is so, I guess, used aggressively. For me, I'm all about the kind of subtlety of it all. And so for me, it's all about picking the right compressor. And this goes throughout the mastering chain, is picking equipment that is inherently going to add to the sound quality that you're trying to get. So if I need to add a little bit more air to something, I'm not going to pick a compressor that has a real dark feel or flavor to it. I'm going to pick something that naturally opens up the sound and starts doing my work for me automatically. So with that, compressors for me in mastering is one of those primary things I'm using 1% to 2% of. I very rarely compress more than 1 or 2 dB. A lot of times will use them more as just a gain staging place to kind of control transients or control the kind of tails of the notes and the beat. So with that, you can also really overdo that again, and this is where people start to suck out the life of the song. And so I guess my main thing is pick the compressors that do your job for you inherently. and then remember, like Q for EQ, attack and release times are huge. Like I never messed with those too much when I was recording unless I was, doing drums, and I honestly was guessing half the time, and especially when I was starting out. Whereas with mastering, your attacks and releases can really, really shape the beat. And it's a big deal. And so, one of my biggest complaints with a lot of masters I hear is you can almost hear the compressor kind of double hit the beat. And that just is weird to me. It's a weird, sometimes it'll be too fast or too slow. And it's not quite working with the beat, and you end up kind of messing the beat up, and instead of adding that punchiness that we all want to it. So that's where your attacks and releases come in, and then getting them to work together depending on how many compressors you're using and things like that. So personally, I like a real fast attack and release compressor working with slower of attack and release. And then that way I've got 2 compressors or 3 compressors, depending on what I'm doing, working on all their own little individual parts of the beat. And so, I might be using one to do just the attacks and one to kind of bring out the in-betweens and another one to kind of shape the entire thing and smooth it all out. And this is where Get Lucky is a great example. Is, like I said, that specific record sounds great on everything, but if you drop it into Pro Tools or something and look at the waveforms, it's almost a solid brick. And but it doesn't sound like it has no dynamics. It doesn't sound like it has, it sounds open and huge and great, but that's because they also did an analog and digital mastering on it. They had a number of people go through the mastering in different formats, but that also is they use their compressors to kind of add a dynamic in that brick. So it may, on the meters, come out, moving maybe 5 dB through the whole thing, whereas sonically it sounds real airy and not squished at all. And that's part of the reason it's been one of those timeless hits. For sure.
So I'm curious, Adam, what are your thoughts? There's a lot of people out there, especially that are, recording, mixing from home, and then they are using services like Lander to master their projects. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on those services? And there are other ones that have popped up and things like that. Do you think that those services can coexist with mastering engineers? Though I guess they are coexisting right now. Overall, what's your opinion on them?
Well, professionally, as them being my main competitors, I hate them. But
right.
But at the same time, music is a personal thing. It was made personally. The artists and the engineers and everybody put their lives and their souls into it. So why are you going to just hand it over to an algorithm at the very end and hope that it just comes out loud? Because mastering is not about being loud. It's about making sure your emotions translate, like I said earlier, through an iPhone, through a club system. I was at a Dodgers game recently, and they were playing some great songs over the PA, which is a terrible PA there, but they still bumped, and they still had that vibe to them.
Right.
They were done right. Those are, Living on a Prayer is one of those great records, and it's lived forever. And that is one of those reasons that it sounds good all across every medium, even on the internet through, a Facebook video or something like that. Whereas just handing yourself over to something like Lander, where I doubt they're really having a real guy sit there and master your song for the $5 or whatever you're paying to them. They have an algorithm, and they are going to just dump it into the algorithm, and it's going to read the technical specs of your mix and then kind of output something that is comparable. And so with that, you're losing the entire human aspect to your music. And you're going to doing that at arguably the most critical point, the finishing point. So as an engineer and a musician, I also am kind of against those kinds of things, just because they do kind of suck the human element out of it. And that's another reason I don't necessarily use things like Isotope or some of these plugins that'll kind of have an all-inclusive mastering chain in them, is because they're not allowing you to make the decisions as an artist to use different things to get different results. And like I said earlier, one of my big lessons was the day the $30,000 Fairchild wasn't the answer. And it was a big deal to me to pull that out because I had one available, and I hated not using it, but that was one of the best decisions I ever made. And I learned a lot from that decision. And so I don't know if Lander would be able to make that decision for you or I don't know if you'd want them to make that decision for you.
Yeah.
If it comes to that. And so it's part of the reason I like engineering and mastering and music so much, is because of the human element. And that's something that in a kind of like increasingly digital world, I do feel like is being sucked out of a lot of elements of our lives, is that human element. Mm-hmm. So it's something I really hold true and kind of dear to myself, is keeping that vibe in people's music and keeping that emotion the same no matter where somebody's listening to it. So I don't know. I also have dealt with people who like love what they got out of some service like that, and I can't help them with that. It's just like, well, maybe your song didn't have a whole lot of dynamics or emotion in it to begin with, or maybe it just happened to work out for you. So it's an interesting thing, but I would definitely suggest, if you can afford it, or if you can, have the abilities to do it yourself and have a real person make those creative decisions for you, And that's also something one of my biggest recommendations is not to master your own music or your own mixes, because, I mean, for me personally, those are the ones I have to work the hardest on. And those are the ones that I probably don't get the best results with because I'm too close to it, or I'm too, I'm hearing the same thing in it. Whereas if I give it to somebody new who's going to bring fresh ears to it, might have a better approach. And also, if somebody is full-time mastering or mixing engineer, you're going to get a whole career's worth of expertise added to your record that you might not get through a service or an algorithm like that.
For sure. Wow. Well, Adam, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right on. And if you'd like to learn more about Adam's work or possibly hire him for professional mixing or mastering services, you can check out his site, harrmixmaster.com. That's HARR mixmaster.com. And of course, if you are interested in learning about in-the-box mastering and watching Adam go through a song step by step and what he would do to a master, you can check out the Mastering Crash Course, which is available right now on AudioSkills.com. Thank you so much for listening today. And as a reminder, for links and information about today's show and our guest, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast. Now go out there and make some great music.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.